Forget everything you think you know about biology, because the human body is a total chaotic mess that occasionally grows its own snack or turns into a literal bar. We are diving into a world where a simple cough might mean you have a forest in your chest, or a routine dental visit reveals hundreds of tiny teeth hiding in your jaw. From a man who turned bright blue to a woman who spoke in a foreign accent after a nap. These are the most ridiculous and mind-blowing medical anomalies ever recorded. Doctors spend decades studying science, only to be completely stumped by these 49 absurd cases that defy every law of nature and common sense. 1. Ron Svaden thought his smoking habit finally caught up to him when he started coughing like a broken lawnmower and struggling for air. Doctors in Massachusetts braced for a scary tumor diagnosis, but the X-ray revealed something much weirder than a mass. It turns out Ron had accidentally inhaled a tiny green pea during a meal, and his warm, moist lung tissue acted like a greenhouse. Instead of dissolving the vegetable, actually germinated and sprouted a leafy green plant right inside his chest cavity. Surgeons were absolutely baffled to find a living garden growing where his oxygen should be. Thankfully, they plucked the tiny sprout out before Ron turned into a human salad, and he made a full recovery. 2. Imagine heading to the dentist for a simple toothache, only to find out your jaw is basically a high-volume manufacturing plant for enamel. A teenager in Mumbai arrived with massive swelling that looked like a typical infection, but the surgical team ended up pulling out a record-breaking 232 individual microteeth. This complex tumor, called an odontoma, had spent years churning out tiny pearl-like structures that were clustered deep inside his bone. It took doctors over 7 hours of meticulous picking and clicking to clear out the entire stash of miniature chompers. Everyone in the operating room was stunned by the sheer mountain of teeth sitting on the tray as the boy finally regained his normal jawline. 3. Getting drunk on a massive bowl of pasta sounds like a total party trick, but for a man in 2013 it was a legal nightmare. Nick Hess from the United Kingdom started acting like a frat boy after eating simple carbohydrates even though he had not touched a single drop of booze. His wife actually filmed him slurring his words and stumbling around the kitchen because she thought he was a secret alcoholic hiding bottles in the garage. After a ton of medical tests, doctors realized his stomach was full of brewer's yeast that turned his dinner into high-proof moonshine. Every time he ate bread or potatoes, his internal factory started distilling alcohol directly into his bloodstream. It took a massive dose of antifungal meds to finally shut down his private gut distillery. 4. Imagine waking up and realizing your skin has permanently turned the color of a ripe blueberry because of some sketchy home remedy you found. In 2008, a man named Paul Karazin from Washington State became a global sensation after he accidentally transformed himself into a real-life version of Papa Smurf. He had been suffering from a skin condition and decided that drinking a homemade cocktail of silver was the best way to fix it. Instead of healing his rash, the silver particles got trapped in his skin cells and reacted with sunlight, just like old-school photography film. He slowly turned a deep shade of silver blue that could never be washed off or reversed, no matter how hard he scrubbed his face. 5. Most people worry about getting a splinter in their finger, but a man in Russia somehow managed to grow an entire evergreen tree inside his lungs. In 2009, a patient named Artyom Sidorkin went to a hospital in the city of Izhevsk because he was coughing up blood and feeling a sharp pain. Surgeons looked at his x-rays and were convinced they were looking at a massive tumor that needed to be removed immediately. When they opened him up, they did not find cancer, but instead discovered a 2-inch-long fir branch growing inside his lung tissue. He had accidentally inhaled a tiny seed that found the perfect warm and wet conditions to start growing into a forest. The needles were poking his internal organs with every breath. 6. Carrying a baby for 9 months is a struggle, but one elderly woman in Colombia managed to do it for over 60 years without realizing it. In 2013, an 82-year-old woman named Estela Melendez went to the clinic after a fall, and doctors spotted a massive hard lump in her gut. They originally thought it was a dangerous tumor, but the X-rays revealed a perfectly formed stone baby that had been inside her since the 1950s. This rare phenomenon called a lithopedion happens when a fetus dies outside the uterus and the body calcifies it to protect the mother from infection. She lived her entire adult life with a literal statue in her belly because removing it was just too risky for her. 7. A woman from Virginia went to bed with a normal American drawl and woke up sounding like she was born in the suburbs of London. In 2010, she was recovering from a health crisis when she opened her mouth and realized her voice had completely changed overnight. She had never lived in England or even visited the United Kingdom, but she was suddenly speaking with a perfect and posh British accent. Doctors diagnosed her with foreign accent syndrome, which happens when the brain's speech center gets rewired during a traumatic injury. Her friends and family were totally confused because she sounded like a different person who just stepped off a plane. Even though she used American slang, her vowels were so fancy, people were constantly baffled. 8. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid the cemetery, but one man in 2013 was absolutely convinced he was already a rotting zombie. A patient named Graham woke up one morning and told his doctors that his brain had died and his internal organs had completely vanished into thin air. He was suffering from a super rare condition called Cotard's delusion, where the mind refuses to believe the body is still functioning properly. Graham stopped eating and bathing because he thought there was no point in taking care of a corpse that was already dead and buried. He even spent time hanging out in local graveyards because he felt that was the only place where he truly belonged with his own kind. 9. If you ever lose your silverware drawer, you might want to check the stomach of a patient who treated a kitchen set like snacks. In 2011, a woman in Arizona walked into the emergency room complaining of a stomach ache that felt like she was carrying a bag of nails. When the doctors looked at the X-ray, they were stunned to see 18 full-sized stainless steel forks sitting neatly inside her digestive tract. She had been swallowing them one by one over several days without causing a single puncture or internal bleed, which seemed physically impossible. Surgeons pulled out the entire collection of utensils, and the patient survived without ever explaining why she chose forks over a regular dinner that night. 10. Losing your eyesight is a tragedy, but one man in the United Kingdom got his vision back thanks to a tooth in his eye. In 2013, a man named Ian Tibbets had been blind for years until a surgeon decided to perform a procedure that sounds like a horror movie. Doctors actually pulled out one of his healthy teeth and carved it into a tiny square to act as a permanent base for a lens. They then shoved the tooth directly into his eyeball because the body is less likely to reject its own bone than plastic. After several months of healing, the tooth eye started working, and Ian was finally able to see his children's faces for the first time in a decade. 11. If you ever feel like your left hand is a copycat that just won't quit, then you might have the same weird brain wiring as a man from New Jersey. He suffers from a bizarre condition called mirror movement disorder, which means his hands are basically twins that refuse to act independently. Every time he tries to pick up a soda with his right hand, his left hand moves in the exact same way, like a glitchy video game character. This makes doing simple stuff like tying shoelaces or typing on a keyboard a total disaster because his fingers are constantly fighting for control. It is like having a permanent shadow that follows your every move, but attached directly to your own nervous system. 12. In 1953, a man in Philadelphia walked into a hospital looking like he was carrying a massive weather balloon inside his stomach area. He had been struggling with a lifelong condition called Hirschsprung's disease, which basically meant his colon forgot how to move waste along the track. Over several decades, his large intestine ballooned to a shocking 25 inches in circumference and ended up weighing over 30 pounds. When surgeons finally removed the massive organ, they realized it was packed with years of literal garbage that his body just could not get rid of. The giant colon was so impressive that it was eventually put on display in a museum so everyone could see the true power of extreme constipation. 13. Most people want a heart of gold, but a patient in 2012 discovered his heart was actually encased in a hard shell like a giant prehistoric egg. He went to the doctor because he was feeling exhausted and short of breath, only to find out his heart was struggling to beat inside a literal cage. A rare condition called constrictive pericarditis had caused the sac around his heart to calcify and turn into a solid layer of bone-like material. It was like his most vital organ was trapped in a stone suit of armor that was slowly squeezing the life out of him. Surgeons had to carefully chip away the hard shell to let his heart finally expand and pump blood freely again. 14. Winter is tough for everyone. But a man in Colorado in 2020 almost died just from stepping out of a hot shower into a chilly room. He collapsed on the floor and started breaking out in massive red hives because his body was literally allergic to the cold. This condition is called cold urticaria, and it means any drop in temperature can trigger a massive and deadly immune response. His family found him struggling to breathe because the cool air in the house was causing his throat to swell shut like a balloon. He had to be rushed to the emergency room where doctors treated him for an allergic reaction, usually reserved for bee stings or peanut butter. 15. Imagine smelling like a dumpster full of rotting fish, no matter how many times you scrub yourself in the shower or use expensive cologne. A man in London suffered for years because his body lacked a specific enzyme needed to break down a smelly compound found in common foods. This rare disorder, called trimethylaminuria, caused a pungent, fishy odor to seep out of his pores and breath every single day. People on the bus would literally move away from him because the scent was so overwhelming and gross. He had to completely change his diet to avoid things like eggs and beans, just to keep the smell from ruining his social life and his career forever. 16. One morning, a patient in 2014 looked in the bathroom mirror and screamed because their tongue had suddenly grown a thick coat of long black hair. It looked like a dark, fuzzy carpet was living in their mouth, and it was actually 15 millimeters long in some spots. This terrifying condition happens when the tiny bumps on your tongue fail to shed and instead grow into long strands that trap bacteria and food particles. The black color comes from all the nasty stuff getting stuck in the fibers and rotting right there on your taste buds. Thankfully, a little extra scrubbing with a toothbrush and some antibiotics usually clears up the hairy mess before it gets too wild. 17. In 2015, a toddler named Jackson Taylor survived a car crash in Australia that should have been absolutely fatal by every law of physics. The force of the impact was so intense that his skull was completely detached from his spine in a horrific injury known as internal decapitation. His head was literally being held onto his body by nothing but skin and a few muscles, while his bones were totally disconnected. Most people die instantly from this, but a team of miracle surgeons spent 6 hours reattaching his neck using wire and a piece of his own rib. The little boy actually walked out of the hospital a few weeks later like a real-life superhero who cheated death. 18. During a massive heat wave in Atlanta back in 1980, a man named Willie Jones broke a world record that nobody ever wants to touch. He was rushed to the hospital with a body temperature of 115.7 degrees, which is hot enough to literally cook your internal organs like a steak. Doctors were absolutely convinced he was a goner because humans usually stop functioning once they hit 108 degrees. They packed him in ice and worked tirelessly to cool his boiling blood before his brain turned into mush. Against all odds, Willie survived the literal meltdown and walked out of the hospital a few weeks later as the toughest man on the planet. 19. Imagine being able to remember every single embarrassing thing you have ever done since you were 12 years old with perfect crystal clarity. A woman named Jill Price has a condition called hyperthymesia, which means her brain is like a giant hard drive that never deletes a single file. She can tell you exactly what she ate for lunch on a random Tuesday in 1985 or what the weather was like on any given day. While it sounds like a superpower, it is actually a total curse because she can never forget a bad breakup or a sad memory. Her mind is constantly flooded with a non-stop loop of her entire life playing back in high definition. 20. The ER at Riverside General Hospital turned into a scene from a sci-fi movie in 1994 when a patient named Gloria Ramirez was brought in. As soon as the nurses drew her blood, they noticed a weird chemical smell and strange crystals floating in the vial. Within minutes, the staff started dropping like flies because mysterious, toxic fumes were leaking out of her body and into the air. 23 hospital workers ended up getting sick, and some were even hospitalized with breathing problems and muscle spasms. The entire emergency room had to be evacuated while hazmat teams tried to figure out how one woman's blood had turned into a literal chemical weapon that knocked out an entire floor. 21. Back in 1965, a Scottish man named Angus Barbieri decided he was absolutely done with being overweight and stopped eating entirely for over a year. He survived for 382 days on nothing but sparkling water and vitamins while doctors watched him in total disbelief. Most people get hangry after missing lunch, but Angus literally melted away 276 pounds without touching a single slice of bread. By the time he finally sat down for his first meal of a boiled egg and some buttered toast, he had completely transformed his body. It remains one of the most extreme fasts in medical history and proves that the human body can sometimes live off its own storage like a literal camel. 22. In 2005, a construction worker named Patrick Lawler from Colorado went to the dentist because he had a nagging toothache that just would not quit. He thought he maybe had a cavity or a gum infection, but the X-ray revealed something much more hardcore than a rotten tooth. It turns out he had accidentally fired a 3-inch masonry nail through the roof of his mouth and into his brain 6 days earlier. He had been walking around working and even eating while a giant piece of metal was shoved deep into his skull without him even realizing it. The doctors were stunned that he was still walking and talking perfectly fine despite having a literal spike piercing his gray matter. 23. A baby girl named Versavia Borin was born in Russia with a condition so rare that her heart was beating completely outside of her ribcage. Instead of being tucked safely behind bone, her heart was only covered by a thin layer of skin on her abdomen like a living, ticking clock. You could literally see the organ pumping and jumping with every beat as she breathed and played like any other toddler. Doctors were terrified that a simple bump or a fall could be fatal, but she defied every medical prediction by growing up into a happy and active child. Her story is a beautiful and bizarre miracle of nature that proves the human heart is way tougher than it looks. 24. An Indonesian man named Didi Koswara lived a nightmare when his hands and feet slowly transformed into what looked like giant gnarled tree roots. After a small cut on his knee as a teenager, his immune system failed to fight off a common virus, and his body started growing massive bark-like warts. He became known as the Tree Man because he could no longer use his fingers or walk properly due to the heavy wooden structures weighing him down. Surgeons eventually stepped in to prune over 13 pounds of the growths so he could finally see his own skin again. It was a tragic and weird case of a regular guy literally turning into a forest creature before science intervened. 25. In the summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg was hit by a bizarre medical emergency where hundreds of people started dancing and literally could not stop. It began with one woman named Frau Trophea, who stepped into the street and started grooving until she collapsed from exhaustion, but then she just got up and kept going. Within a month, nearly 400 people were caught in a rhythmic trance, dancing until their feet bled and their hearts gave out. Modern scientists think they might have accidentally eaten moldy bread that acted like natural LSD, causing a massive hallucination. It was history's deadliest dance party and a reminder that sometimes your own brain can totally betray your physical limits. 26. A little girl in 2012 gave her parents a heart attack after she swallowed 30 small, high-powered magnets that she thought were shiny candies. Once the magnets reached her intestines, they started snapping together through the walls of her gut and pinching her internal organs into a giant metallic knot. Doctors had to perform emergency surgery to untangle the magnetic mess before it ripped holes through her entire digestive system. It was a terrifying reminder that even the smallest household toys can turn into a deadly internal trap if a curious kid decides to have a snack. Thankfully, she recovered fully, but her family definitely cleared out every single magnet from the house after that crazy hospital visit. 27. A man named Tyson Smith from California made medical history in 2011 when he walked out of a hospital with two separate hearts beating in his chest. His original heart was failing, but it was still doing a little bit of work. So doctors decided to just add a second donor heart right next to it. They essentially installed a backup engine to help push blood through his body because a full transplant was too risky at the time. He could actually feel both organs thumping away in a weird rhythm that kept him alive and well for years. It is one of the coolest and strangest surgical hacks ever performed, where having a spare part actually saved a human life. 28. Lydia Fairchild from Washington State almost lost her kids in 2002 after a routine DNA test claimed she was not actually their biological mother. The government thought she was a fraud, but the truth was way weirder because Lydia was actually her own twin. She had a rare condition called chimerism, where she absorbed her twin sister in the womb and ended up with two completely different sets of DNA in her body. One set was in her skin and blood, while a totally different set was in her reproductive system, which caused the test to fail. It took a massive legal battle and a lot of science to prove that she was a biological miracle rather than a criminal. 29. In a truly horrifying 2024 investigation, it was revealed that a surgeon in Florida had been using a common hardware store screwdriver as a permanent spinal implant. Instead of using high-grade medical titanium, he decided to just grab a tool from his garage and screw it directly into a patient's back during surgery. The patient had no idea they were walking around with a literal piece of discount hardware holding their spine together until things started going horribly wrong. This bizarre and dangerous shortcut shocked the entire medical community and led to a massive scandal about what actually happens when doctors stop following the rules. It is a terrifying reminder to always double-check who is working on your engine. 30. A young woman in Italy shocked doctors in 2017 when she checked into a clinic because she was literally sweating blood from her face and palms. She did not have any visible cuts or scrapes, but the red liquid would just start oozing out of her skin whenever she got stressed or upset. This super rare condition is called hematidrosis, and it happens when extreme pressure causes tiny blood vessels to burst and leak into the sweat glands. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie or a religious miracle, but it was actually a very real and painful medical disorder. Doctors had to use blood pressure medication to finally stop her skin from weeping red every time she felt anxious. 31. Imagine waking up and feeling your muscles slowly turning into solid rock until your entire body becomes a living statue. A patient named Harry Eastlack suffered from a terrifying condition called fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, where the body's repair mechanism goes absolutely haywire. Every time he got a tiny bruise or a bump, his body didn't grow new muscle, but instead grew solid bone in its place. Over time, his joints became permanently frozen as his skeleton branched out like a coral reef inside his skin. By the end of his life, he could only move his lips because his entire torso and limbs had fused into a single, immovable block of bone. His skeleton is now on display to help scientists study this bizarre stone disease. 32. A man in India gave doctors the shock of their lives in 2017 when he arrived at the hospital with a stomach that felt like a heavy bag of gravel. When surgeons opened him up, they didn't find a tumor, but instead pulled out over 12 pounds of solid metal coins and rusted nails. The patient had spent a decade swallowing pocket change like it was candy, which caused his stomach to sag all the way down into his pelvis. The weight was so extreme that it was literally stretching his internal organs like a piece of old elastic. It took hours of fishing through his digestive tract to recover over 350 individual coins that had been sitting in his gut for years. 33. Trying to fall asleep is hard enough without feeling like a literal grenade just went off inside your skull every time you close your eyes. Many patients suffer from a wild neurological glitch called exploding head syndrome, where they hear massive imaginary bomb blasts or crashing cymbals right as they drift off. It is not a dream and it is not a ghost, but rather a sudden burst of neural activity in the brain's sound processing center. The noise is so loud and realistic that people often jump out of bed thinking their house is actually collapsing or that someone fired a gun. While it sounds terrifying, it is actually harmless, even though it makes getting a good night's rest feel like a total battlefield experience. 34. An Oregon woman named Abby Beckley thought she just had a persistent, itchy eye until she reached in and pulled out a wiggling half-inch worm. She ended up pulling 14 tiny translucent worms out of her own eyeball over the course of several weeks after walking through a swarm of flies. It turns out a specific type of cattle fly had landed on her face and deposited larvae that decided her eye was the perfect place to start a family. This was the first time this specific parasite had ever been found in a human, and doctors were absolutely grossed out by the discovery. Thankfully, once the last worm was evicted, her vision returned to normal, and she could finally stop blinking at guests. 35. A man in California shocked the medical world when he coughed so hard that he spat out a perfect 6-inch blood clot shaped like a tree. This was not just a random blob of red, but an exact anatomical cast of the right bronchial tree from inside his lung. The blood had somehow perfectly clotted inside the narrow airways and stayed intact as he forced it out of his throat in one giant piece. Doctors were stunned to see the delicate branches and tiny tubes preserved in such a gruesome yet beautiful way. It looked like a piece of red coral or a biological sculpture that had been hiding in his chest. Sadly, the patient was very ill, but the image remains a legend. 36. An elderly woman in the United Kingdom started her day by hearing a full orchestra playing loud classical music that simply would not stop. She searched her entire house for a hidden radio or a noisy neighbor, but eventually realized the music was coming from inside her own ears. This bizarre condition, called musical ear syndrome, happens when the brain gets bored from hearing loss and starts hallucinating its own private concert. She was stuck listening to the same show tunes and hymns on a non-stop loop for months, like a broken record player in her head. Doctors explained that her mind was just trying to fill the silence, but she probably would have preferred a simple pair of earplugs instead. 37. A man rushed to a Canadian emergency room in 2007 with blood that had turned a dark and swampy emerald green color. The medical team was absolutely terrified, thinking they were dealing with an alien or a toxic chemical spill from a local factory. It turns out he had been taking massive doses of a sulfur-based migraine medication that chemically altered the hemoglobin in his red blood cells. His body was functioning fine, but his veins were filled with a liquid that looked more like lime soda than human blood. Once he stopped taking the pills, his blood eventually returned to a normal red color, but he certainly gave those doctors a story they will never forget for the rest of life. 38. When his ship's doctor died in the middle of a frozen Antarctic wasteland in 1961, Dr. Leonid Rogozov realized he was the only person left to perform surgery. He was suffering from a burst appendix and knew he would die if he didn't act fast, so he decided to operate on himself. Using a mirror and a small flashlight, he sliced open his own abdomen and carefully cut out the infected organ while he was fully awake. He had to take breaks because he kept passing out from the pain and the sheer absurdity of digging around in his own guts. He successfully stitched himself back up and lived to tell the tale of the ultimate DIY medical procedure in the coldest place on Earth. 39. A World War II veteran named Huang Yuanfan from China lived for over 50 years with a literal bullet lodged deep inside his brain without ever knowing it was there. He had been struck by a stray round during a battle in his youth, but the wound healed over and he just figured he had a permanent headache. It wasn't until he went in for a routine scan in his 80s that doctors found the rusted piece of lead sitting right next to his vital centers. He had lived an entire life, got married, and worked a full career while carrying a deadly projectile in his skull. The bullet had stayed perfectly still for half a century, proving that the human brain is surprisingly spacious. 40. Charles Osborne from Iowa started hiccuping in 1922 while he was trying to weigh a hog, and he didn't stop until 1990. For 68 straight years, he hiccuped about 40 times a minute, which adds up to roughly 430 million times over his lifetime. He learned how to breathe and eat around the constant jerking of his diaphragm, and even managed to get married and have 8 children despite the noise. Doctors tried everything from surgery to experimental drugs, but nothing could break the spell until the hiccups randomly vanished 1 year before he died. He finally got to experience the sound of silence for the first time in nearly 7 decades, before he peacefully passed away in his sleep. 41. In 1875, workers in Philadelphia were digging up an old cemetery when they discovered a man whose body had turned into a literal block of solid soap. Instead of rotting away naturally, the damp soil conditions and high alkaline levels in the earth reacted with his body fat to create a substance called adipocere. He became known as the Soap Man because his remains were preserved in a hard, waxy shell that looked exactly like a giant bar of ivory soap from the grocery store. This weird chemical reaction basically turned his entire corpse into a permanent statue that refused to decompose, even after a century underground. His slippery remains are now kept in a museum where visitors can marvel at the man who accidentally became a cleaning product. 42. An emergency room in Pakistan became the site of a very awkward medical mystery when a man arrived with a fully intact glass light bulb stuck in his rectum. He claimed he had no idea how the fragile object got there, but doctors were terrified that a single wrong move would shatter the glass and cause a fatal internal disaster. The medical team had to work with extreme precision, using specialized tools to slowly rotate the bulb and pull it out without it popping like a giant light bulb-shaped balloon. It was one of those cases where the staff had to keep a straight face while performing a high-stakes rescue mission on a patient who was literally glowing from the inside out. 43. A girl named Brooke Greenberg from Maryland lived for 20 years without ever aging a single day past her toddler phase. While her sisters grew up and went to college, Brooke remained frozen in time with the body and mind of a 1-year-old infant. Doctors were completely baffled by her condition, which they eventually named Syndrome X because they could not find a single genetic reason why her clock had simply stopped ticking. She kept her baby teeth and her high-pitched giggle well into her 20s, as if her body was holding on to a permanent fountain of youth. Her case remains one of the biggest mysteries in biology because she basically proved that aging might not be as inevitable as we think. 44. Imagine being so allergic to water that even your own tears can cause painful red hives to break out across your face. A teenager named Tessa Hanson Smith from California suffers from a super rare condition called aquagenic urticaria, which makes a simple shower feel like she is being splashed with hot acid. She cannot go for a swim or walk in the rain, and even drinking a cold glass of water can cause her throat to swell up in a terrifying reaction. Her body sees the most basic element of life as a dangerous invader that must be fought off at all costs. She has to live her life in a constant state of dryness, just to keep her skin from burning. 45. A 16-month-old girl in Beijing was crying and scratching at her ear, so her parents took her to the doctor thinking it was a simple infection. When the surgeon looked inside her ear canal, they did not find fluid, but instead saw a fully bloomed yellow dandelion growing right next to her eardrum. A tiny seed had somehow blown into her ear and found the perfect, warm, and moist conditions to sprout and grow into a 2-centimeter long flower. The plant had actually taken root in the skin of her ear canal and was starting to expand before the medical team carefully plucked it out. It was a literal garden growing in a place where only whispers should be. 46. A doctor named Joel Salinas from Massachusetts has a superpower that is actually a total curse because he physically feels every sensation he sees other people experiencing. If he sees a patient getting a shot, his own arm stings, and if he watches someone stub their toe, he feels a sharp jolt of pain in his own foot. This rare condition, called mirror pain synesthesia, means his brain's empathy center is turned up to 1,000%, and he cannot filter out the world around him. He has to stay incredibly calm in the emergency room while people are screaming because his own body is constantly mimicking the trauma of every single person he tries to treat. 47. A homeless man in Miami arrived at the hospital with a massive and neglected head wound that looked like it should have been a death sentence. When the doctors peeled back the bandages, they were horrified to see thousands of live maggots squirming around inside the deep gash on his scalp. However, they soon realized that the gross insects were actually the only reason the man was still alive and breathing. The maggots had specifically eaten only the dead and rotting infected flesh, while leaving the healthy tissue completely untouched, which prevented a fatal blood infection from spreading to his brain. The doctors let the bugs finish their lunch before cleaning out the wound and marveling at the world's grossest natural surgeons. 48. A 60-year-old woman at a wedding in Israel thought she was grabbing a big scoop of delicious avocado dip, but she actually ate a giant glob of spicy wasabi. The instant heat was so intense that she felt a massive surge of pressure in her chest and thought she was having a literal heart attack. Doctors at the hospital realized she was suffering from Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, which is also known as broken heart syndrome, usually caused by extreme emotional stress. In her case, the physical shock of the spicy condiment caused her heart's left ventricle to balloon out and stop pumping properly. She survived the spicy ordeal, but she will definitely be double-checking the green dip at every party from now on. 49. A 38-year-old man in New York had been struggling with a blocked nose for years and just assumed he had a really bad deviated septum. When he finally went to a specialist, the doctors performed a scan and found a hard white object lodged deep inside his right nostril. It turned out that a fully formed human tooth was growing upside down through the floor of his nose and into his nasal cavity. This bizarre ectopic tooth was causing constant irritation and making it nearly impossible for him to breathe through his face. Surgeons successfully pulled the rogue chomper out of his nose, and the man was finally able to take a deep breath without a molar getting in the way. The human body is basically a giant biological glitch that loves to grow random vegetables in your lungs. If you survived all 49 medical disasters without passing out, you are officially a legend. Help out the channel and give your brain a little brain fumble by smashing that like button and subscribing for more absurd history. Turn on notifications and share this with your friend who thinks every sneeze is a terminal illness. Now tell me in the comments which case was the most ridiculous. Would you rather have a lung pea or a tooth in your eye?